there are some rules that space travelers quickly learn to follow. Never trust the Arcturians was one such rule, mostly because they could sell you a starship one minute, then leave you stranded in an asteroid field the next. Avoid bargains that sound too good to be true was another one, because, in deep space, the true cost of things often wasn't revealed until long after you signed the contract. But for Captain Elisa Kairos of the Odyssey, there was one rule she had learned the hard way that she could never shake off: never lend money to humans. It's a trap. She had broken that rule once. And now, it was going to cost her everything. It had started with a simple promise, an innocent loan to a fellow traveler, someone she thought she could trust. A good deed. That's all. She should have known better. She should have known that humans, in space, could be even more treacherous than the entire crew of a pirate ship. And so, now, sitting in her captain's chair on the Odyssey, Elisa stared at the blinking red light on her communications console, dreading the transmission she was about to receive. Captain Kairos, the voice crackled through the speaker, "This is the Galactic Debt Collection Bureau. We regret to inform you that your outstanding debt has now reached an unacceptable level. If you fail to make arrangements for repayment, we will be forced to." Elisa didn't wait for the rest. She slapped the console off and slumped back in her seat, letting out a frustrated sigh. Her fingers instinctively drummed on the armrest. This was it. This was the mess she'd gotten herself into. It all started 2 months ago, in a dimly lit bar on the station Myrax 12. Elisa had been there with her crew, trying to relax after an exhausting mission to deliver a diplomatic package to the Martian colonies. They'd landed at the station for refueling, a quick stop before heading to their next assignment. She should have known that Myrax 12 was the last place to look for anything remotely relaxing. She had been sitting at a table near the bar, nursing a drink, when a man had approached her. A human, about her age, wearing the tattered remains of a once immaculate uniform that seemed to scream disgraced officer. His name was Jaden, and he had been charming enough to win her over with his easy smile and soft voice. "I need your help," he had said, after a few minutes of casual conversation. "A small loan. I've been stuck on this rock for weeks now. My ship's in the repair bay, and I can't make the payment. I'm sure I can get back on my feet, but I just need a little assistance to make sure I don't end up working in the docking bay for the next year." Elisa had hesitated. She had no intention of lending money to anyone, especially not a stranger, but there was something in his eyes that seemed genuine. Or maybe it was the sincerity in his voice. Or maybe it was the hint of desperation. "How much?" she had asked, her tone skeptical but polite. 2,000 credits, Jaden had said, and her gut had twisted at the number. It was a lot, but not so much that she couldn't spare it. She could have bought a few upgrades for the Odyssey with that money, but she was just about to get her next paycheck. She had a soft spot for those in need. 2,000, she repeated, narrowing her eyes. "You'll pay me back, right?" "Absolutely," he had said, almost too quickly. "Once my ship's up and running, I'll be good as new. You'll have your money in no time." Elisa had trusted him. She had known the risk, of course, but she hadn't thought it would come to this. He seemed trustworthy enough. She wasn't an expert on human body language, but his expressions, the way he spoke, everything seemed convincing. And yet, now, 2 months later, the only thing she had received from him were half-baked excuses and empty promises. The loan had turned into an impossible-to-collect debt. Her communicator buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, the message was clear: final notice. It was only a matter of time before the Galactic Debt Collection Bureau sent its agents after her, and she'd rather avoid that. Their methods were effective but ruthless. It was then that she heard the shuffle of boots behind her. She turned, recognizing the figure immediately. "Everything all right, Captain?" Lieutenant Zara Wyland, her right-hand officer and friend, leaned against the doorway of the bridge, arms crossed. Her expression was calm, but there was a knowing glint in her eyes. Zara had always had a way of reading Elisa's moods. "No," Elisa sighed. "It's not. We're in trouble, Zara." Serious trouble. Zara raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. She knew better than to ask for details too quickly. Can I help? Elisa's gaze flickered back to the blinking red light. I'm going to need more than just help. I'm going to need a miracle. Zara frowned. What happened? I made a bad decision. I lent money to the wrong person. A human, of course, Elisa said bitterly. Jaden. You remember him, right? Zara nodded slowly. The guy with the sad story. You thought he was a good guy? Yeah. Well, turns out that sad story wasn't the worst thing about him. Elisa's voice dropped as she continued, now the Galactic Debt Collection Bureau's on my tail. They don't just collect debts, she stopped herself before going into further detail. Zara had heard rumors about the Bureau's methods before. Okay. So, what's the plan? Zara asked, her voice all business now. Elisa let out a long breath, her mind racing. I don't know. I have 2,000 credits on me, but it's not enough to make this go away. Even if I borrowed from the crew, they'd never let me hear the end of it. I can't keep running. Zara frowned, walking over to the console and tapping a few buttons. You don't think they'll send someone after you, do you? Some bounty hunter or enforcement officer? More likely, Elisa said, standing up from her chair. And you know what? I don't think I'm ready to face the consequences just yet. She turned toward the main viewport of the ship. I'm going to find Jaden, and I'm going to get that money back. I don't care how I do it. Zara raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. All right. Then I'm coming with you. Elisa half smiled, her expression hardening with determination. That's what I like about you, Zara. Always up for a challenge. The two of them left the bridge in silence, both fully aware of the gravity of the situation. As they made their way to the docking bay, Elisa couldn't help but wonder what kind of person Jaden truly was. What had gone wrong? Why hadn't he paid her back? Was it all part of some con? Or was he really just another pawn in a much bigger game? The thought gnawed at her as the Odyssey prepared to launch for a destination she hadn't yet fully prepared for. One thing was certain, she was about to dive headfirst into a situation that would push her resourcefulness and cunning to the limits. Whether it was a trap, a misunderstanding, or something far more sinister, Elisa was determined to solve it. And she was willing to risk everything to do it. There was just one small problem, she didn't know how deep this trap went. The Odyssey's engines hummed steadily as it cruised through the dark expanse of space, the stars twinkling far off in the distance like cold, distant fireflies. Elisa sat in the captain's chair, her eyes fixed on the navigational console, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than just a debt collection. If there was one thing she knew about space, it was that things were rarely as simple as they seemed. Where are we headed again? Zara asked, her voice breaking the silence as she stood next to Elisa. She glanced over at the holographic map on the console, her arms folded in front of her chest. Her posture was casual, but Elisa could see the subtle tension in her stance. She knew her lieutenant well, Zara was always ready for anything, but she also never let her guard down. Alien 9, Elisa replied, her voice even. I've been keeping track of Jaden's whereabouts through some old contacts. He's supposed to be there, living off the grid, trying to lay low. Zara nodded slowly. You think he's hiding from the Bureau? I don't know. But if he is, he's got good reason, Elisa muttered, glancing at the console as the ship neared the planet. Alien 9 wasn't a paradise, that was for sure. It was a backwater planet, far from the core worlds, a place where the law was only as strong as the local enforcement could manage. Crime ran rampant, and there were rumors that some of the galaxy's most notorious criminals used it as a haven. Guess we'll find out when we get there, Zara said with a wry smile. If he's even still there. Elisa had thought about that too. Jaden wasn't exactly someone who stuck around in one place for long. But the fact that his last known coordinates pointed to Alien 9 made her think that maybe, just maybe, he had nowhere else to go. The Odyssey broke through the thin atmosphere of Alien 9, and the planet came into view, a desolate world, covered in red dust, with jagged mountain ranges and craters littering its surface. The only signs of life were small settlements scattered across the planet's surface, their structures hastily built from scraps and salvaged materials. Not the kind of place you'd bring your family for a vacation, Zara remarked dryly as she peered out the viewport. Elisa smirked. Not my first choice, either. But we don't have the luxury of choice right now. They landed in one of the smaller docking bays at the edge of the largest settlement, a place called Paris Town. The bay was quiet, save for the soft whir of maintenance droids going about their work. Elisa could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on her as she and Zara exited the ship. They were out of time. The Bureau was closing in, and if they didn't find Jaden soon, things could get a whole lot worse. The air outside was dry, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a blood-red hue across the landscape. Elisa adjusted the collar of her jacket, shielding herself from the heat, and looked around the barren town. Small structures lined the streets, but most of the people here were too busy with their own problems to notice the newcomers. It was the kind of place where the wrong people could disappear, and Elisa was hoping Jaden wasn't one of them. Zara turned to her. So, where do we start looking? Let's check the local tavern, Elisa said, squinting into the distance. The flickering neon sign of a bar a few blocks away caught her eye. If Jaden's trying to lay low, there's a good chance he's hanging around a place like that. The walk to the tavern was short but uneventful. Most of the townsfolk kept their heads down, casting curious glances at the two women but not daring to say anything. Elisa couldn't blame them. People who lived on Alien 9 had a way of minding their own business. The tavern was dimly lit, with the heavy smell of stale alcohol and grease filling the air as they stepped inside. A handful of patrons sat at the bar, their voices low and gravelly as they exchanged hushed words. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man with a face like an old leather boot, eyed them warily but didn't say anything. Elisa scanned the room, looking for any sign of Jaden. There was no way to know if he was here, but the bartender might know something. Hey, she said, approaching the counter and leaning on it casually. I'm looking for someone. Goes by the name Jaden. Seen him around? The bartender looked her up and down, his eyes narrowing. He was sizing her up, trying to decide whether she was trouble or just another traveler. Elisa held his gaze, letting the silence stretch on until he finally spoke. Never heard of him, he muttered, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. His voice was gruff, but there was something about the way he said it that made Elisa feel like he knew more than he was letting on. She didn't press further. Instead, she turned her attention to the room. A group of men at the far end of the bar caught her eye. They were laughing too loudly, gesturing with their drinks as if they were trying to appear as though they didn't have a care in the world. They didn't look like the kind of people who would have information, but something about their demeanor made Elisa think they might know more than they were letting on. Zara, ever the pragmatist, gave Elisa a side glance. You want to try them? Elisa hesitated. The last thing she needed was a confrontation with a group of rowdy drunks. But she was running out of options. Let's see if they know anything. As they approached the group, one of the men, a tall figure with a ragged beard, looked up and caught sight of them. His eyes shifted, then flicked back to his friends as if he was trying to decide if they were worth acknowledging. Got a problem, ladies? The man asked, his voice slurring slightly. He wasn't completely drunk, but it was clear he had more than a few drinks in him. Elisa didn't waste time on pleasantries. We're looking for someone. Jaden. Do you know him? The man's face twisted into a knowing grin. Jaden, huh? Yeah, we know him. He's been in and out of here. Always looking for something, or someone. Elisa leaned forward. Where is he? The man's smile faded. He looked at his companions, who suddenly grew quiet. Look, I don't know where he is now, he said, his voice low. But if you're looking for him, you might want to check the old shipyard on the outskirts of town. Last time I saw him, he was headed that way. Something about getting out of here, before the wrong people found him. Elisa's heart skipped a beat. The shipyard. That was the last place she had expected to hear. But it made sense. If Jaden was trying to escape his problems, a shipyard would be the perfect place to lay low. "Thanks," she said, throwing a few credits on the counter. She turned to Zara, who was already moving toward the door. As they made their way out, Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The shipyard was waiting. The journey to the shipyard was swift, but as they approached the outskirts of Paris town, Elisa could feel the tension in the air. The once familiar hum of the Odyssey's engines was replaced by the eerily quiet rustling of wind across barren land. Dust kicked up in waves, swirling around the skeletal remains of forgotten ships, some of which looked like they hadn't seen a flight path in decades. A derelict landscape, a place where dreams went to die. Elisa clenched her jaw. It was a fitting location for a man like Jaden, she thought. If he had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, this was exactly where he would end up. "You think he's here?" Zara asked, her voice cutting through the silence as they neared the entrance to the shipyard. Her hand rested on her sidearm, her body posture tense, eyes darting from shadow to shadow as though she could feel the danger hanging in the air. "I'm sure of it," Elisa replied, though her confidence was laced with doubt. "He wouldn't go anywhere else. If he's trying to lay low, this is the only place that makes sense." The shipyard was a sprawling mess of wreckage, crashed freighters, dismantled shuttles, and abandoned transports left to rot under the harsh sun. The closer they got to the gates, the more Elisa realized that the shipyard wasn't just a haven for those trying to escape the law. It was a haven for those who were out of options, those who needed to disappear. A few workers loitered nearby, covered in grease and sweat, their faces obscured by dust masks or helmets. But none of them seemed to pay any attention to Elisa and Zara. They were used to strangers. They were used to people who had no place in the galaxy but had nowhere else to go. They approached a large warehouse at the center of the yard. It was an old military transport ship, gutted and repurposed into a sort of makeshift office. The structure's faded red exterior was cracked and weathered, and the only sign that it might house anyone at all was the faint glow coming from one of the port side windows. "Here," Zara said, her hand resting lightly on the door handle. "What's the plan?" Elisa paused, trying to push aside the gnawing feeling in her gut. Every instinct told her this was it, Jaden was inside. But something about the silence, the way the workers had avoided eye contact, told her that they weren't the only ones who knew about the shipyard's darker side. "We'll talk to him first," Elisa said, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. "If he's here, we'll get the truth out of him." Zara nodded and pushed the door open, revealing a darkened room filled with crates, old machinery, and half-finished ships. The air was thick with the smell of oil, rust, and something more dangerous, like the scent of people trying to escape their pasts. At the far end of the room, a lone figure stood hunched over a small workbench, his face obscured by the dim light. Elisa's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the unmistakable silhouette. "Jaden," she called out, her voice carrying through the room. "It's over." The man didn't turn around. He didn't even flinch. Elisa stepped closer, her boots clanging on the metal floor, the sound amplified by the emptiness around them. "Jaden, you've got nowhere to run," Elisa repeated, her voice firmer this time. "I need that money. Now." At last, Jaden turned. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. The years, or perhaps the weight of his own lies, had taken a toll on him. He didn't look like the man Elisa remembered, the charming, seemingly genuine traveler who had convinced her to lend him money. He looked like someone who had given up on everything. "Elisa," he said slowly, his voice raspy. "You shouldn't have come." "I should have known better than to trust you," Elisa said bitterly, taking a step forward. "But I'm not leaving here without what you owe me. I don't care how you got into this mess. It's time to pay up." Jaden let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the galaxy was on them. "You don't get it, Elisa. I'm not running from you. I'm running from them." "Who?" Elisa demanded. "The Bureau. You owe me, Jaden. I don't care who else you owe, or who you're hiding from. You're going to make this right. Jaden's eyes darted around the room, almost frantic. He looked like a cornered animal, his fingers twitching as if he was deciding whether to reach for something, or someone. The Bureau is nothing compared to the people I'm running from. They're the ones who made me take that money, Elisa. They made me do it. What the hell are you talking about? Elisa's patience was thinning, but she could hear the hint of desperation in Jaden's voice. It was a different kind of fear, one she wasn't used to seeing from him. There's a bigger game at play here, Jaden continued, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not just here because of a loan. You're part of something much bigger now. And the Bureau? They're just one part of it. Elisa felt a chill run down her spine. She stepped back, eyeing him more warily now. What do you mean? Jaden swallowed hard. He took a shaky step toward her, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket. When he pulled his hand back out, he was holding something small, a data chip. He extended it toward her. This is what they really wanted, he said, his voice tight with fear. It's all on here. It's why I got involved in the first place. Elisa took the chip cautiously, her mind racing. She didn't know what it contained, but her gut told her it was important. The kind of important that could change everything. You're in deeper than you think, Elisa, Jaden continued. You've been set up as much as I have. The Bureau, they don't just collect debts. They're orchestrating something much bigger. And if you don't get out now, you'll be next. A sharp sound echoed through the room, footsteps. Zara's hand went instinctively to her sidearm as the sound grew louder, approaching fast. They weren't alone. Elisa, you have to. Jaden's warning was cut short by the sudden noise of the door slamming open. Elisa's eyes went wide. Standing in the doorway were three armed figures, their faces obscured by helmets. The insignia on their armor was unmistakable, Galactic Debt Enforcement. Too late, one of them said, their voice muffled by the helmet's filter. You're coming with us, Captain. Elisa's blood ran cold as she quickly calculated her options. They were outnumbered. But there was no way she was going down without a fight. Zara's eyes locked with hers. The decision was made in an instant. Take cover! Zara shouted, drawing her blaster. Gunfire erupted, the first shot ringing out as one of the enforcement officers raised his weapon. Elisa's heart raced. This was it. The confrontation she had been dreading had finally arrived. But she was ready. The shipyard exploded into chaos. Gunfire rang out in rapid succession, the sharp, echoing cracks bouncing off the rusted hulls of abandoned ships. Elisa dove behind a stack of crates, her heart pounding in her chest as she peered around the edge, trying to get a sense of where the enforcement officers were. Zara was already returning fire, her blaster shots lighting up the dark corners of the warehouse as she moved strategically, staying low and fast. Elisa quickly assessed the situation. The enforcement officers were too well armed for a direct assault. Their armor was reinforced, and they had the advantage of numbers. Jaden, meanwhile, was huddled behind a metal pillar, his eyes wide with panic. Jaden, get up! Elisa yelled over the gunfire. We don't have time for this. He didn't answer, his face pale with fear. Elisa's frustration flared, but she didn't have time to deal with it. She could already hear the sounds of more footsteps outside. More reinforcements were coming. Elisa, we need to move. Now! Zara shouted, dropping behind the same crates. She ducked down, her voice lower now, focused. We've got seconds before they bring in heavy artillery. Elisa nodded. She pulled Jaden to his feet with one hand, the other gripping the data chip he had given her. She glanced around the room, searching for any way out. The shipyard's back doors were barely visible through the haze of smoke and dust, but they were their only escape route. The enforcement officers didn't seem to have noticed the escape path yet. They were too focused on Zara's precise, calculated shots, trying to get her pinned down. Elisa grabbed the blaster from the holster at her side and fired a few quick shots herself, distracting one of the officers long enough for Zara to reposition. "Move, move!" Zara shouted, urging Elisa to take cover behind a large shipping container. They dashed for the back door, Jaden stumbling behind them. They burst into the open air, the harsh wind of Alien 9's barren landscape slapping their faces as they ran. The shipyard was only a few hundred meters from the nearest hills, and they had to make it there before the enforcement could regroup and surround them. They didn't have much time. As they sprinted through the dust, Elisa's mind raced. The data chip. The Bureau wasn't just interested in collecting debts, they were orchestrating something far bigger. What had Jaden gotten them involved in? And how far did it go? "Where's the ship?" Elisa called out to Zara, her voice tight with urgency. "It's on the other side of the shipyard," Zara replied, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "We'll make it. But we need to get there first." Jaden was struggling to keep up, his steps faltering. Elisa could hear his shallow breathing as they moved through the gusting wind. He was not in a good condition, emotionally or physically. The panic still hadn't left him, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be right behind them. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a speeder engine roared to life. Elisa looked up to see a large, heavily armed speeder tearing across the open space, headed directly toward them. One of the enforcement officers was driving, the other standing at the rear with a heavy blaster cannon aimed directly at them. "We've got company," Zara shouted. "Run faster." The speeder closed the distance between them in seconds. Elisa's heart raced. She knew they couldn't outrun it. They had to think faster. Think smarter. "We need to split up," Elisa said, making a snap decision. "Zara, take Jaden and head for the cliffs. I'll draw them off." "What?" Zara shot her a look of disbelief. "You're not." "Elisa's right," Jaden said, his voice a rasping whisper. "They're not after me anymore. They're after her." "Damn right," Elisa replied, glancing over her shoulder. The speeder was almost on them now. She had seconds to act. Zara hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Be careful." "I always am," Elisa said with a crooked grin, though her stomach was tight with the knowledge of what she had to do. Zara grabbed Jaden's arm and pulled him in the opposite direction, heading toward the cliffs that led to the higher, rocky terrain. Elisa watched them go, then turned her attention back to the speeding speeder. She gripped the blaster tightly and took a deep breath. She could do this. The speeder's cannon fired, and Elisa dove to the side, barely avoiding the blast. The explosion of dirt and metal left her ears ringing, but she was already moving again, darting between wrecked ships for cover. Another blast followed, this time aimed closer to her. Elisa ducked down behind a damaged shuttle, her eyes scanning for any way out. The shipyard was a maze, but she was intimately familiar with every corner. She'd spent weeks studying the area when they first arrived, scouting for potential exits in case something went wrong. And now, things were definitely going wrong. She reached the edge of the shipyard, where a small, half-constructed freighter sat. It was barely functional, but it was their only shot. The ship wasn't fast, but it had engines. And right now, Elisa was willing to take anything she could get. She sprinted toward the freighter, her legs burning with every step. The speeder was still on her tail, the cannon firing repeatedly, but Elisa didn't slow down. She couldn't. As she reached the freighter, she quickly climbed up the side, using the worn ladders to reach the cockpit. The familiar hum of the engines greeted her as she jumped into the pilot's seat. She slapped a few buttons, bringing the ship's systems to life. A few warning lights flashed, but Elisa didn't care. She just needed it to move. The speeder was almost on her now. The gunner was aiming straight for the cockpit. Elisa slammed the throttle forward, jerking the ship to life just as the blaster cannon fired one last time. The blast missed by inches, but the force of it rattled the freighter, sending it careening toward the open sky. The ship lurched upward, engines sputtering as Elisa fought to control the craft. Her hands gripped the controls tightly, steering the freighter higher, dodging debris and smoke as she rose into the air. The speeder was close, but not close enough. Elisa's breath came in ragged gasps as she soared above the shipyard, leaving the chaos behind. The enforcement officers would be following, but they wouldn't catch her. She glanced down at the data chip in her hand. It wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a key. A key to understanding everything that had been going on behind the scenes. The Bureau's real intentions. And what they planned to do next. But for now, Elisa allowed herself a moment of relief. She had survived, and she had made it out of the mess. She had taken a risk, and it had paid off. As the freighter soared into the stars, she allowed herself a grim smile. She hadn't just survived the trap she'd walked into. She had turned it around. And now, the real game began.